If you were to sit on the banks of the Danube, the Rhine, or the Thames and watch the water flow by, you might imagine that the land around you is as permanent and unchanging as the riverbed itself. We tend to view history as a series of still photographs, fixed moments where people stayed in their places, spoke their languages, and lived within clear, unmoving borders. But if you look closer at the water, you see it is never the same from one second to the next. It is a constant state of transition. This is the true story of Europe. To understand the modern European immigration crisis, we must step away from the shouting matches of cable news and the frantic scrolling of social media. Instead, we must look at the deep, ancient roots of this story. We must examine what is real, what is myth, and how the echoes of the past have shaped the anxieties of the present. Before we can ask if Europe is truly doomed, or if the Great Replacement is a mathematical reality or a fearful fiction, we must understand how the stage was set. We must understand that the crisis did not begin in a vacuum. It began in the wreckage of empires and the hunger of post-war factories. To understand migration in the 21st century, we have to look at the great reversal of the 20th. For hundreds of years, Europe was not a destination. It was a departure lounge. This is a fact often forgotten in the modern heat of the debate. Between 1815 and 1930, over 60 million people left Europe. They were the migrants of their day. Millions of Irish fled the Great Famine. Italians escaped poverty in the south. Germans, Swedes, and Poles sought land and religious freedom in the Americas. European identity was exported to every corner of the globe, often through force and colonization. At that time, the world was being Europeanized. But following the devastation of World War II, the flow of the world's human river began to change direction. The exporter of people became the importer. In 1945, Europe was a continent of ghosts and rubble. Conservative estimates suggest that over 40 million people had died across the continent. Cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and Rotterdam were skeletal remains. The surviving population was exhausted, malnourished, and displaced. Yet, amidst this ruin, a strange thing happened. The economic miracle began to stir. To rebuild, Europe needed hands. It needed millions of them to clear the bricks, pour the concrete, and man the assembly lines. This was not an invasion by dire necessity. It was an invitation by dire necessity. The governments of Europe looked toward their horizons and realized they could no longer rely solely on their own battered populations. In the United Kingdom, the story often begins at the Tilbury docks on a grey morning in June 1948. A ship called the Empire Windrush arrived, carrying 492 passengers from Jamaica. Many were veterans of the Royal Air Force who had fought for what they were taught to call the mother country during the war. They arrived in their Sunday best, carrying suitcases and hope, answering a call from the British government to help rebuild a nation short on labour. At the time, they were British subjects with a legal right to be there under the British Nationality Act of 1948. This act was a pivotal moment. It granted the right of settlement to all citizens of the British Empire, a move designed to maintain the bonds of a fading empire. But even in these early quiet moments, the seeds of modern tension were planted. While the government welcomed the labour, the native population often met these newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and coldness. The first fake narrative we often encounter is the idea that friction is a new phenomenon created by modern multiculturalism. Even then, in the late 1940s, there were graffiti tags and political murmurs about keeping Britain white. The friction we see today is not a new invention. It is an old wound that never quite healed. The Windrush generation didn't come to replace anyone. They came to fill the gaps left by a generation of British men who never came home from the trenches or the beaches of Normandy. Yet, the presence of these newcomers forced a question that Europe still hasn't fully answered. Can a nation's identity survive when its people no longer look like they did a century ago? Across the English Channel, France was undergoing its own massive transformation during what historians call the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years of economic growth between 1945 and 1975. To fuel its factories and massive state construction sites, France looked to its colonies in the Maghreb. Thousands of men from Algeria, Morocco and Tunisia were recruited to build the apartment blocks and metro lines of Paris and Lyon. But here, a different kind of mistake was made, one that would haunt the future. The French state treated these migrants as units of labor rather than human beings with families. They were housed in foyers, essentially massive, sterile dormitories located on the outskirts of the cities. They were separated from the rest of French society by design. The government assumed these men would work for a few years and then disappear back across the Mediterranean. This physical separation was the beginning of what would later become the parallel societies we hear so much about today. It was a failure of urban planning and human foresight, not a secret conspiracy. By keeping these workers on the periphery, the state ensured they would never fully integrate into the fabric of French life. This created a geographical and psychological wall that still exists in the banlieues today. As the 1950s turned into the 1960s, the French landscape began to change again. The Algerian War of Independence was a brutal, scarring conflict that ended in 1962. It didn't just end a colonial era, it triggered a massive movement of people. Hundreds of thousands of Pieds Noirs, French settlers living in Algeria, returned to a France many of them had never actually seen. Alongside them came the Harkis, Muslim Algerians who had fought on the side of the French and were now fleeing for their lives. This was a moment of deep trauma for France. It was a reminder that the empire was not just a collection of far-off lands, but a living connection that would inevitably come home to roost. The arrival of these groups wasn't a choice. It was the messy, painful conclusion of a colonial story that France had started centuries earlier. Perhaps the most striking and influential example of this era was the West German Gastarbeiter, or guest worker program. By the late 1950s, West Germany's economy was growing so fast, the Wirtschaftswunder, that it had reached what economists call overemployment. There were more jobs than people. The Berlin Wall had been built in 1961, cutting off the flow of workers from the east. So, West Germany signed recruitment treaties with Italy, Greece, Spain, and eventually, most significantly, with Turkey. The very name guest worker tells you everything you need to know about the mindset of the time. A guest is someone who visits, stays for a short while, and then leaves. The German government intentionally designed these contracts to be temporary. They expected these men to work for 2 years, save their Deutsche Marks, and return to their villages in Anatolia or Sicily. But history is rarely so mechanical. These guests became essential to the economy. German factory owners didn't want to retrain a new workforce every 2 years. They wanted to keep the skilled workers they already had. The workers, in turn, began to marry, to have children, and to find a sense of belonging in the quiet suburbs of Stuttgart or the industrial heart of the Ruhr. There is a famous quote by the Swiss author Max Frisch that defines this entire era. We asked for workers, but human beings came. Human beings do not just work. They fall in love. They build communities, and they put down roots. When the 1973 oil crisis hit, and the global economy shuddered, European governments tried to pull the plug on these programs. They offered repatriation bonuses, cash to go home. But for many, there was no home to go back to. Their children spoke German or French better than Turkish or Arabic. This was the moment the temporary became permanent, and it happened without a grand plan. It was the result of 1,000 small human decisions made by people who simply wanted a stable life. To understand the real versus the fake in the demographic debate, we have to look at the history of internal European migration. There is a common belief that before these waves of migration, European nations were perfectly uniform, unchanging blocks of people who had lived in the same spot since time immemorial. But this is a historical mirage. Consider the Ruhrpolen, the hundreds of thousands of Poles who moved to the German Ruhr Valley in the late 1800s to work the coal mines. At the time, they were viewed with intense suspicion and even hatred. They were Catholic in a Protestant land. They spoke a foreign tongue. They were seen as a threat to the pure German worker. There were riots and calls for their expulsion. Fast forward a century, and their descendants are the bedrock of German society. Their Polish last names, names like Szymanski or Podolski, are now seen as traditionally German. The same can be said for the Huguenots, the French Protestants who fled to Prussia and England in the 17th century to escape religious persecution. They were initially seen as a burden, a cultural mismatch that would ruin the local economy. Yet, they brought the skills that helped build the Prussian silk industry and British banking. The reality we must face is that European culture has always been a sponge, absorbing and being reshaped by those who enter it. The fear we feel today is often a fear of the speed of change and the visibility of the newcomers rather than change itself. In the past, the migrants were often fellow Christians or fellow Europeans. Today, they often come from different religious and social frameworks, and this is the friction point that creates the replacement anxiety. As we move into the 1980s and 90s, the atmosphere began to darken. This was the era when the identity of Europe began to be defined by what it was not. The Cold War was ending, which removed the common enemy of communism that had united Western Europe for decades. Globalization began to hollow out the old industrial heartlands. The factories that had once welcomed the guest workers were closing down, moving to Asia or becoming automated. In their place, a new kind of anxiety grew. If there is no work, and the guests are still here, who are they, and who are we? This was when the children of the first migrants, the second and third generations, began to come of age. They were caught in a cultural no man's land. They weren't fully accepted as native by the societies they were born in, yet they felt like strangers in the countries of their parents. It was in this fertile soil of economic decline and identity crisis that the first modern theories of replacement began to grow. These weren't yet the polished internet memes or political slogans of today, but rather a growing, quiet sense of loss. People looked at their high streets and saw mosques where there had been churches, or heard languages they didn't understand in the grocery store. To some, this felt like an invasion because it was happening in the neighborhoods of the working class, while the elites remained in their protected, expensive enclaves. The fake part of the narrative is often the idea that this was a coordinated, top-down plan by a secret group of elites to destroy European culture. History suggests it was much messier than that. It was a combination of corporate greed for cheap labor, government short-sightedness, and the unintended consequences of post-colonial ties. The real part is that the rapid change caused a genuine deep sense of alienation among the working class who felt left behind by their own governments. They felt like the rules of their society were changing without their consent. By the time we reached the turn of the millennium, the stage was set for a perfect storm. The population of Europe was aging rapidly. Birth rates among native Europeans had plummeted below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman. In countries like Italy and Germany, the demographic pyramid was becoming an inverted triangle. There were more retirees than workers. To maintain the pension systems and the healthcare services that Europeans had come to expect, more people were needed. At the same time, the population of the Middle East and Africa was booming. You had a wealthy, shrinking, aging continent sitting right next to a young, restless, and increasingly unstable one. From the perspective of a historian or a demographer, the pressure for people to move from the global south to the north is as inevitable as gravity or the movement of tectonic plates. It is a physical law of human geography. People will always move from areas of high pressure and low opportunity to areas of low pressure and high opportunity. No wall in history has ever successfully stopped that flow forever. The concept of replacement often hinges on the idea that this is a zero-sum game, that for every newcomer, a native person is erased. But history shows that populations don't just replace one another. They merge, they clash, they influence, and they evolve. The ancient Romans feared the arrival of the Goths, and the Vandals would mean the end of civilization. In a sense, they were right. The Roman version of civilization did end. But what rose in its place was the foundation of modern Europe. Is Europe doomed? If doomed means that Europe will never look exactly like it did in 1950 again, then the answer is a simple yes. But history tells us that the Europe of 1950 looked nothing like the Europe of 1850, which looked nothing like the Europe of 1750. Change is the only constant. The fear of replacement is, at its core, a fear of the end of a specific version of a story. But the story of Europe is not a book with a final chapter. It is a series of volumes that are still being written. As we look toward the present day, we see that the echoes of empire and the hunger of post-war industry brought the world to Europe's doorstep. We have seen how the guest became the neighbor and how the temporary became permanent. We have dismantled the idea that friction is new and explored the reality that Europe has always been a continent in motion. In the years leading up to 2015, the tension was simmering beneath the surface. The European Union had expanded, the euro had been established, and the borders between European nations had largely vanished. But while it was easy for a Frenchman to work in Germany or a Pole to work in Ireland, the external borders of the continent were becoming more fortified. This fortress Europe was a response to the growing pressure from the south. But as any historian knows, a fortress is only as strong as the stability of the world around it. And in 2011, the world around Europe began to catch fire. The Arab Spring, which started with such hope for democracy, quickly spiraled into chaos in many places. None was more devastating than the civil war in Syria. This conflict wouldn't just stay within its borders. It would send shockwaves across the Mediterranean and into the heart of every European capital. It would lead to the images of the boats, the heartbreak on the beaches, and the moment when the logistics of a continent were pushed to the absolute breaking point. The story of migration is often told in statistics, but it is lived in the footsteps of individuals. It is the story of a father in Aleppo deciding to risk everything on a rubber dinghy, and the story of a shopkeeper in a small Greek village suddenly finding his beach full of strangers. Both are real. Both are part of the history we are living through. As we move closer to the modern day, we must ask what happened when the pressure finally broke the dam. We must examine the moment when Angela Merkel uttered the famous words, "Wir schaffen das." We can do this. Was she right? Or did she open a door that can never be closed again? To find the truth, we must continue to peel back the layers of fear and rhetoric, looking for the human heart of the crisis. The simmering heat of 2011 was a turning point that few in the comfortable capitals of Europe truly understood at the time. It began with the Arab Spring, a wave of protests and revolutions that swept across North Africa and the Middle East. To many Western observers, it looked like a triumph of democracy, a digital revolution led by young people seeking the same freedoms enjoyed in Paris or Berlin. But as the old dictators fell, they left behind a vacuum. And history teaches us that a vacuum never stays empty for long. In Libya, the collapse of the Gaddafi regime turned a once policed coastline into a wide-open gateway. In Syria, what started as a protest spiraled into a multi-sided civil war of such staggering brutality that it would trigger the largest displacement of people since the end of the Second World War. This is where the modern crisis truly takes its shape, moving from a steady, manageable flow into a flood that would test the very foundations of the European Union. To understand the real versus the fake during this period, we have to look at the numbers and the geography. By 2014, the Mediterranean Sea had become a graveyard. Thousands of people were drowning in an attempt to cross from Libya to Italy. But it was in 2015 that the geography of migration shifted toward the Balkan route. This was a path that led from Turkey to the Greek islands, then up through the forests and fields of the Balkans toward the heart of Europe. If you had been standing on the shores of Lesbos in the summer of 2015, you would have seen something that felt like a biblical migration. Hundreds of rubber dinghies, overfilled and straining against the waves, arriving every single day. This was the moment the logistics of a continent met the desperation of 1 million souls. And it was here that the narrative of replacement found its most potent fuel. The images on the news were of young men marching along highways, of crowds pressing against the fences of railway stations in Budapest, and of tents filling the parks of major cities. For many Europeans, this didn't look like the guest worker programs of the 60s. It looked like a loss of control. It felt as if the borders had simply ceased to exist. This brings us to one of the most significant fake narratives that took hold during this time. The idea that this was an invasion organized to destroy European identity. When we look at the reality, we see a much more chaotic, uncoordinated tragedy. The people coming were not a monolithic army. They were a fragmented group of families, students, doctors, and laborers, fleeing a war that had destroyed their homes. Yet the visibility of the migration was so high that it created a psychological shock. For the first time, the distant problems of the Middle East were no longer distant. They were standing in the middle of Munich's central station. In late August 2015, German Chancellor Angela Merkel made a decision that would define her legacy and polarize a continent. Faced with thousands of refugees stranded in appalling conditions in Hungary, she decided to suspend the Dublin regulation. This was a rule that stated refugees had to apply for asylum in the first European country they entered. Merkel realized that Greece and Hungary were buckling under the weight. If Germany didn't act, a humanitarian disaster of epic proportions was inevitable. She uttered 3 words that still echo through European politics. "Wir schaffen das." We can do this. In those first few weeks, there was a wave of Willkommenskultur, or welcome culture. People at German train stations cheered as the refugees arrived, offering water, food, and clothing. It was a moment of profound collective empathy. But as the days turned into weeks and the hundreds became hundreds of thousands, eventually reaching over 1 million in Germany alone, the mood began to shift. The reality of the crisis was not just about the number of people, but about the speed of their arrival. Schools were turned into shelters. Gymnasiums were filled with cots. Local administrations were overwhelmed. This was the friction point where the real logistical struggle began to merge with the fake fear-mongering. One of the most persistent fakes that emerged during this period was the profile of who was arriving. Critics of the migration pointed to the fact that a large percentage of those arriving were young men. The narrative was that these were not refugees, but economic migrants, or even a Trojan horse of soldiers. The reality was more complex. In many cultures, the youngest and strongest member of the family is sent first to navigate the dangerous and expensive journey. The plan was often for these men to gain legal status and then bring their wives and children through safe, legal, family reunification channels. However, the optics of thousands of young men in city centers created a sense of insecurity that populist politicians were quick to exploit. This sense of insecurity was supercharged by the events of New Year's Eve 2015 in Cologne. Reports of mass sexual harassment and robberies by groups of migrant men shocked the German public. For many, this was the end of the welcome culture. It was a moment where the clash of cultures became a terrifying reality rather than an abstract debate. Here, the real issue was a failure of policing and a failure to integrate people into European norms of behavior. But the fake narrative used this tragedy to argue that all migrants were inherently dangerous or uncivilized. This is a classic pattern in history. A genuine failure or crime is used to condemn an entire group of people, making it impossible to have a nuanced conversation about how to solve the problem. As we move deeper into the mid-2010s, we see the rise of a new kind of politics across Europe. Parties that had once been on the fringes, the AfD in Germany, the National Rally in France, and various movements in Sweden and Italy, began to surge. Their message was simple: Europe is being replaced, and your leaders have betrayed you. This is where the Great Replacement theory moved from the shadows of far-right forums into the mainstream of political discourse. It offered a grand, unifying explanation for why everything felt different. It claimed that the aging of the European population and the arrival of migrants were not two separate trends, but a single, orchestrated plot. But if we look at the data, the real math of the situation, the replacement theory falls apart under scrutiny. While it is true that the percentage of foreign-born residents has increased, it is nowhere near the levels required to replace the native population. For example, even after the 2015 crisis, the vast majority of people living in Germany are of German descent. What is happening is not a replacement, but a diversification. It is the same process that London underwent decades earlier, or that New York has experienced for over a century. The fake part is the idea that this process is an endpoint, a death of a culture. The real part is that this diversification happens so fast that it outpaces the ability of social institutions to adapt, leading to the parallel societies we discussed before. While the politicians argued in the parliaments, the borders of Europe were being transformed. The fortress Europe that had been a metaphor became a literal reality. Hungary built a massive razor-wire fence along its border with Serbia. Other countries followed suit, reintroducing border checks within the supposedly borderless Schengen area. The internal unity of Europe was fracturing. The Eastern European countries, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, refused to take in refugees, arguing that they were protecting their Christian heritage and that they had never been colonial powers, so they had no moral debt to pay. This created a deep rift between the East and the West, a rift that remains one of the greatest threats to the survival of the European Union today. To solve the crisis, Europe eventually turned to a controversial deal with Turkey in 2016. In exchange for billions of euros and political concessions, Turkey agreed to take back migrants who crossed illegally to Greece. This deal worked in terms of numbers. The flood slowed to a trickle. But it came at a high moral and political cost. Europe had essentially outsourced its border control to a regime that was becoming increasingly authoritarian. It was a real solution to the numbers, but it left the underlying crisis of identity completely unaddressed. If we stop to breathe and look at the landscape of Europe today, we see a continent that is still haunted by the ghosts of 2015. The crisis changed the way Europeans think about their future. It created a permanent sense of emergency. But it also proved something about European resilience. Despite the predictions of doom, the European social model did not collapse. The 1 million people who arrived in Germany have largely been housed, and many are now working and learning the language. The invasion did not happen. Life in the villages of Bavaria or the suburbs of Stockholm continues, altered but not destroyed. The question of whether Europe is doomed by immigration often assumes that culture is like a fragile glass vase that shatters if you touch it. But history shows that European culture is more like a forest. A forest changes its composition over time. New species of trees arrive, some old ones die out, and the landscape shifts. It is still a forest, but it is not the same forest it was 500 years ago. The fear of replacement is a fear of the loss of the familiar. And while that fear is real in the hearts of millions, the reality is that Europe has always been a work in progress. As we continue our journey through this history, we have to look closer at the most sensitive topic of all: integration. Why do some groups blend into the fabric of society so easily, while others seem to remain on the outside for generations? Is it the fault of the host country or the fault of the newcomers? To answer this, we have to move past the headlines and look at the schools, the workplaces, and the dinner tables where the future of Europe is actually being decided. We have to look at the parallel societies and ask if they are a temporary stop on the way to integration or a permanent feature of a fractured continent. We must also confront the economic engine of migration. While the populist narrative says that migrants are a drain on the welfare state, the real economic data tells a much more complicated story. In an aging Europe, who will drive the buses? Who will care for the elderly in the nursing homes? Who will pay the taxes that fund the very pensions that the native population is so worried about protecting? The irony of the immigration crisis is that the very thing many people fear, the arrival of newcomers, might be the only thing that can save the European way of life from demographic collapse. In our next exploration, we will dive into these parallel societies. We will look at the banlieues of Paris, the neighborhoods of Malmö, and the suburbs of Brussels. We will separate the fake myths of no-go zones from the real challenges of social isolation and crime. We will ask what happens when a continent tries to become a melting pot, but forgets to turn on the heat. This is a story of how a society lives together when its members no longer share the same history, but are forced to share the same future. The transition from the immediate shock of 2015 into the long-term reality of a changing Europe brings us to one of the most contentious and misunderstood aspects of the entire story: the concept of parallel societies and the reality of cultural friction. To understand the real versus the fake in this context, we have to walk through the streets of places like Saint-Denis in Paris, Molenbeek in Brussels, or Rosengård in Malmö. These names have become shorthand in the media for failure, no-go zones, and the Islamization of Europe. But as with everything in history, the truth is far more layered than a headline can capture. It is a story of how geography, architecture, and economics can conspire to create a sense of two worlds living in the same space, yet never touching. One of the most powerful fake narratives circulating today is the myth of the no-go zone. You have likely seen the maps or heard the pundits claim that there are areas in European cities where the police are afraid to enter, where Sharia law has replaced national law, and where non-Muslims are forbidden from walking. If you were to visit these neighborhoods with an open mind, you would find a reality that is both more mundane and more tragic. There are no no-go zones in the sense of mini-states within states. The police do enter these areas, the mail is delivered, and the laws of the Republic still technically apply. However, there are high-priority areas, places where social order is fragile, where crime rates are higher, and where the relationship between the residents and the state has completely broken down. These are not occupied territories, they are neglected territories. When a fire truck is pelted with stones in a Swedish suburb, it isn't because the residents want to establish a caliphate. It is often because the state is seen only as a uniform, a siren, and a hand that arrests, rather than a hand that helps. The reality of the parallel society is not a conspiracy of the migrants to take over. It is often the result of a perfect storm of failed urban planning, economic exclusion, and cultural isolation. Remember the foyers and apartment blocks we discussed from the 1960s? Those buildings didn't just house workers. They became the boundaries of a new kind of segregation. In France, this took the form of the grands ensembles, massive, high-rise housing projects built with good intentions to provide modern plumbing and light to the working class. But by the 1980s, as the middle class fled to the suburbs, these projects became traps. When you place thousands of people from the same background in a massive concrete housing project on the outskirts of a city, far from the centers of commerce and culture, you aren't creating a melting pot. You are creating a pressure cooker. Over decades, these areas became self-contained worlds. If you live in a neighborhood where every sign is in a language other than the national tongue, where the shops sell the food you grew up with, and where you rarely interact with the native population, except in a position of subservience or conflict, your Europe is a very small, very narrow place. This is where the Great Replacement theory gains its psychological weight. A native European might drive past one of these neighborhoods and see a street where every sign is in Arabic or Turkish, where the women wear hijabs, and where the native population is nowhere to be seen. To that observer, it looks like replacement. It feels like the world they knew has vanished. But if you step inside those neighborhoods, you find a generation of young people, the second and third generations, who are struggling with a profound crisis of identity. They are often not Middle Eastern or African, enough for their ancestral homes. yet they are not European enough for their birth countries. They are caught in a cultural no man's land. This sense of not belonging is the fertile soil for radicalization, but also for a deep, simmering resentment that occasionally explodes into the riots we have seen in France and Sweden. These riots are often described as religious in nature, but when you look at the real motivations, they are almost always triggered by police incidents or feelings of systemic injustice. They are cries for visibility in a society that prefers to keep them on the periphery. The real cultural friction often comes down to a clash of values regarding secularism, gender, and individual rights. Europe, particularly since the Enlightenment, has moved toward a very specific version of society: secular, liberal, and centered on the individual. This is particularly true in France, where laïcité, the strict separation of church and state, is a secular religion in itself. Many of the migrant communities arriving today come from societies that are communal, traditional, and deeply religious. This is a genuine friction point that cannot be dismissed as racism. When a French schoolteacher tries to teach a lesson on the freedom of speech using controversial cartoons, or when a Swedish town debates whether to allow a call to prayer from a minaret, these are not small issues. They are fundamental disagreements about what the public square should look like. The fake narrative tells us that these two worldviews are fundamentally incompatible and that one must inevitably destroy the other. The real history of Europe, however, shows that native European culture was not always secular or liberal. It took centuries of bloody religious wars between Catholics and Protestants for Europe to reach its current state of tolerance. The challenge today is whether the European model can absorb a large population with different values without losing its own core principles. One of the most visible friction points is the role of women and the visibility of religion in public life. In the native European worldview, the removal of the headscarf was seen as a victory for feminism and secularism. To see it return in the streets of Berlin or Brussels feels, to some, like a step backward into the Middle Ages. But to the women wearing it, it can be a symbol of identity, a shield against a hostile world, or a personal choice of faith. This misunderstanding creates a real social distance. When you cannot agree on the basic symbols of the public square, it becomes very difficult to build a shared sense of we. This is why some European countries have moved toward integration contracts or mandatory language classes, attempts by the state to force a shared reality where one does not exist naturally. Let's look at the replacement myth through the lens of demographics again, because this is where the fear of the parallel society turns into a fear of extinction. The theory often claims that because migrant families have higher birth rates, they will eventually outbreed the native population. In the short term, the real data supports the fact that first-generation migrants do have more children, but a fascinating and consistent trend in demography shows that by the second and third generation, the birth rates of migrant families almost always converge with the native population. In Germany, for example, the birth rate of Turkish origin women has plummeted over the last 30 years. As women become more educated and gain more economic independence, and as families adapt to the high cost of living in Europe, their family sizes shrink. The demographic takeover is often a statistical illusion that assumes current trends will continue forever, ignoring the fact that human behavior changes as environments change. The replacement isn't a tidal wave, it's a ripple that eventually settles into the same rhythm as the rest of the pond. While we talk about replacement, we often ignore the real replacement that is happening. the replacement of the working class by the service economy. In many European cities, the native working class has moved out to the suburbs or the countryside as the old industrial jobs vanished. The migrants moved into the centres or the inner ring suburbs to take the low-wage jobs that keep the city running, cleaning the offices, driving the Ubers, and working in the kitchens. This creates a geographic sorting that reinforces the appearance of replacement. The native population sees their old neighbourhoods changed and feels a sense of loss, but they often forget that they were the ones who left in search of a different life. This is the gentrification of identity. The people who can afford to live in the pure European neighbourhoods are often the ones who benefit most from the cheap labour provided by the people in the parallel societies. The cultural friction is also heightened by the digital age. In the 1970s, a Turkish worker in Cologne was largely cut off from his home village. He had to read the local German newspapers and watch German television. Today, a migrant can live in London, but spend their entire day in a digital world of their home country. They can watch satellite TV from Istanbul, Cairo, or Islamabad, and stay in constant contact with their relatives via video calls. This digital bridge makes integration much more difficult than it was in the past. It allows the parallel society to exist not just in a physical neighbourhood, but in a mental space that is thousands of miles away. This is a real challenge for modern states, as it makes it harder to create a shared national narrative. When half the population is watching the national news and the other half is watching news from a completely different cultural perspective, the public square fractures. However, we must also address the fake idea that migration has brought nothing but conflict and decay. If you look at the real cultural landscape of Europe today, it is undeniably richer and more dynamic in many ways. The food, the music, the literature, and the sports of Europe have been transformed. From the French national football team, which is a kaleidoscope of the former empire, to the vibrant art scene in Berlin, or the literary prizes won by authors of migrant descent in the UK. The new Europeans are contributing to a culture that is evolving. The doomed narrative focuses entirely on the friction while ignoring the fusion. A culture that does not change is a culture that is already dead. The vibrancy of London or Paris doesn't come from a static past, but from the constant, often messy interaction of different people. But we cannot talk about fusion without addressing the real and rising problem of crime and security in these parallel societies. It is a statistical fact in several European countries, most notably Sweden and Denmark, that certain migrant groups are overrepresented in crime statistics, particularly in gang-related violence. For a country like Sweden, which for decades was one of the safest societies on earth, the rise of bombings and shootings in migrant-heavy suburbs has been a traumatic shock. Populist politicians use these real numbers to argue that migration is inherently dangerous and that some cultures are incompatible with peace. But a historian or a sociologist would point out that these numbers are almost always tied to real factors of poverty, lack of education, and social exclusion. If you take any group of young men, isolate them in a poor neighborhood with no job prospects, and give them the sense that the society around them sees them as enemies, you will see a rise in gang culture. The fake narrative says the crime is in their DNA or their religion. The real narrative says it is a symptom of a failed social structure that creates a vacuum of authority. This leads us to the most difficult question. If the parallel societies are real and the friction is real, what is the future? Is Europe moving toward a balkanization, where different groups live in hostile, separate enclaves? Or is this just a particularly difficult phase of a long-term integration process? History suggests that the answer depends on the state. Where the state is strong and provides a path to citizenship and economic success, integration eventually wins out. We see this in the silent majority of migrants who are not in the headlines: the doctors, the engineers, the small business owners who have integrated so well that they are invisible to the crisis narrative. The problem is that integration is boring and doesn't make the news. Conflict is exciting and fuels the algorithms of social media. The Great Replacement Theory is a story told by people who are afraid of losing their power and their sense of place. But the reality of the immigration crisis is a story of millions of individual lives trying to find a place in a world that is moving faster than our institutions can handle. The crisis is not that people are moving. The crisis is that we have not yet built the social structures to make that movement work for everyone. When a society stops offering a vision of the future that includes everyone, people retreat into their tribes. This is true for both the native population and the newcomers. As we look deeper into this story, we must confront the fortress Europe that has been built to keep these parallel societies from growing any larger. We have to look at the Mediterranean, at the walls in Poland and Hungary, and at the rise of the surveillance state. We have to ask, if Europe defines itself as a fortress, what happens to the values of freedom and human rights that it claims to protect? And if the fortress eventually falls, as all fortresses do, what will be left of the Europe we are trying to save? The fear of replacement is ultimately a fear of the unknown. But as we have seen from the Windrush to the guest workers and beyond, the unknown eventually becomes the familiar. The stranger eventually becomes the neighbor. The question for Europe is not whether it will be replaced, but whether it will have the courage to redefine itself for a new century. The water of the Danube and the Rhine continues to flow, and the people along their banks continue to change. The crisis is a moment in time, but the transformation is the long, slow work of history. We are living through a chapter that is still being written, and the ending is far from certain. But to understand where we are going, we must keep looking at the reality beneath the surface of the fear. We must examine the walls we build, not just the ones made of stone and wire, but the ones we build in our minds. In our next exploration, we will turn our gaze to the physical borders of the continent. We will look at the rise of Frontex, the tragedy of the Mediterranean crossings, and the fortress that Europe has become in its attempt to stop the tide of history. We will see the real cost of security and the price that is paid in human lives every single day on the edges of the map. The hardening of European hearts and the construction of physical barriers brings us to the most literal manifestation of the crisis, the rise of Fortress Europe. To understand the modern border, we have to look at how a continent that once prided itself on tearing down the Berlin Wall and opening its internal frontiers has, in just a few decades, surrounded itself with more wire, more sensors, and more guards than at any point in its history. This is the story of Frontex, the Mediterranean crossing, and the legal grey zones, where the values of the European Enlightenment meet the cold reality of national security. It is here that we find some of the most harrowing realities and some of the most pervasive fakes in the entire migration debate. The real transformation of the European border began quietly in 2004 with the creation of Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. Originally, it was a small coordinating body with a modest budget. But after the shock of 2015, Frontex was transformed into a powerhouse. Today, it is the first uniformed service of the European Union, with its own ships, aircraft, and eventually a standing corps of 10,000 guards. The fake narrative often portrays Frontex either as a benevolent rescue service or, on the other extreme, as a paramilitary force designed to hunt people. The reality is that Frontex exists in a state of permanent moral and legal tension. It is tasked with two contradictory goals: to uphold the fundamental right to seek asylum and to prevent irregular entry. On the high seas, these two goals often collide with tragic results. When we talk about the Mediterranean route, we are talking about the deadliest border in the world. Since 2014, more than 30,000 people have officially been recorded as dead or missing in these waters, though the real number is likely much higher, as many shipwrecks are never documented. The fake narrative often suggests that these people are invaders, being ferried across by non-governmental organizations or NGOs. There is a persistent myth that the presence of rescue ships acts as a pull factor, encouraging more people to take the risk because they know they will be saved. However, multiple academic studies and internal EU reports have shown that people take the risk regardless of whether rescue ships are present. They are pushed by war, hunger, and climate change, not pulled by the hope of a life jacket. The reality of the crossing is a brutal industry run by smuggling cartels that treat human beings like disposable cargo. In the Fortress Europe era, the smugglers have adapted. They no longer use sturdy wooden boats. They use cheap, inflatable rubber dinghies that are barely seaworthy for a lake, let alone the open sea. They often provide only enough fuel to reach international waters, where they hope the migrants will be picked up by a passing merchant vessel or a Coast Guard ship. This is the real logistics of the crisis, a deadly game of chicken played with thousands of lives. When European governments began to crack down on NGO rescue ships, accusing them of collaborating with smugglers, the real result was not a decrease in departures, but an increase in drownings. One of the most controversial realities of Fortress Europe is the practice of pushbacks. A pushback is the forced return of people across a border before they have had the chance to apply for asylum. Under international law, this is illegal. The principle of non-refoulement dictates that a state cannot return someone to a place where they face a risk of persecution or death. Yet, at the edges of the map, in the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey, or in the forests between Poland and Belarus, there is overwhelming evidence that pushbacks have become a standard, if unofficial, policy. Masked men on high-speed boats have been filmed disabling the engines of migrant dinghies and towing them back toward Turkish waters. At the Polish border, migrants have been pushed back and forth through razor-wire fences in freezing temperatures, trapped in a no-man's land between two hostile states. This brings us to the concept of externalization. If Europe doesn't want to get its own hands dirty with pushbacks, it pays others to do it. This is the real architecture of the fortress. We see this in the billions of euros sent to the Libyan Coast Guard, a collection of militias often linked to the very smugglers they are supposed to stop. When the Libyan Coast Guard intercepts a boat, they bring the people back to detention centers in Libya. Human rights organizations have documented horrific realities inside these centers: torture, extortion, and modern-day slavery. From a legal standpoint, Europe can say it isn't violating human rights because the interceptions happen in Libyan waters. But from a moral standpoint, the fortress is merely outsourcing the suffering to keep it off European television screens. The fake narrative surrounding the border often focuses on the idea of total control. Politicians promise that with enough walls and enough technology, the tide can be stopped. But history shows that borders are not walls, they are filters. The more you block one route, the more dangerous and expensive another route becomes. When the Balkan route was fenced off, the central Mediterranean route became more active. When that was policed, people began taking the Atlantic route to the Canary Islands, an even longer and more dangerous journey. The reality is that as long as the pressure differential between a wealthy Europe and a struggling global South exists, people will find a way through. The fortress doesn't stop migration. It simply increases the market rate for smugglers and the mortality rate for migrants. We must also examine the real role of technology in Fortress Europe. The border is no longer just wire and concrete. It is a digital panopticon. Drones with thermal imaging circle the skies. Satellites track the movement of small boats, and biometric databases store the fingerprints of every person who crosses. This technology is sold as a way to make borders smart and humane, but in practice, it often serves to further dehumanize the people on the other side. A human being becomes a heat signature on a screen, a data point to be managed or diverted. This real dehumanization makes it easier for societies to accept the tragedies that happen at sea. If we don't see them as people with names and stories, we don't feel the weight of their loss. The Great Replacement theory thrives on the idea that the fortress is failing because it is being breached by a coordinated enemy. But the real history of 2015 and the years that followed shows a Europe that was not being invaded, but a Europe that was deeply confused. The crisis was not a failure of the border, but a failure of solidarity within the border. When Italy and Greece were overwhelmed, other European nations looked the other way. This real internal division is what allowed the crisis to spiral. The fortress was built not just to keep them out, but to keep the European project from falling apart under the strain of its own internal disagreements. The fences in Hungary and Poland were built as much to send a message to Brussels as they were to stop migrants. While the physical fortress grows, a legal fortress is also being constructed. New EU laws are moving toward border procedures, where people are detained in camps at the edge of the continent while their claims are processed in a matter of days. This is designed to make it easier to deport those whose claims are rejected. The fake narrative says this will solve the crisis by removing the incentive to come. The real challenge is that deporting people is incredibly difficult. Many home countries refuse to take their citizens back, and many migrants destroy their documents to make it impossible to prove where they are from. The reality of the fortress is a growing number of people living in a legal limbo. They are in Europe, but they are not of Europe. They cannot work legally, they cannot leave, and they cannot stay. This is the real recipe for the parallel societies and crime problems we discussed earlier. Is the fortress doomed to fail? If we look at history, no wall has ever successfully isolated a civilization forever. From the Great Wall of China to the Roman limes, borders eventually become the places where cultures mix, not where they stop. The irony of Fortress Europe is that the more it tries to isolate itself, the more it becomes dependent on the very world it is trying to shut out. The real economy of Europe, its agriculture, its construction, its care for the elderly, relies on the labor of the people who find their way through the cracks in the wall. The fortress is a political theater, a performance of control, staged for a nervous electorate, while the real movement of people continues beneath the surface. The Great Replacement myth relies on the idea of a pure inside and a corrupting outside. But the reality of the border shows that the inside and outside are deeply intertwined. The conflicts in Syria, Libya, and the Sahel that drive migration are often fueled by European arms, European geopolitical interests, or the historical echoes of empire we started with. The fortress is an attempt to escape the consequences of a globalized world. But you cannot have globalized trade and globalized communications without globalized movement. The fake part of the narrative is that we can choose to have one without the other. As we look at the ships of Frontex and the fences of the Balkans, we see a continent at war with its own geography and its own history. The crisis at the border is a mirror of the crisis of the European soul. Can a continent that defines itself by human rights and the rule of law survive if it allows its borders to become lawless zones of suffering? If the price of security is the abandonment of the very values that make Europe, Europe, then what exactly are we protecting? The water of the Mediterranean, like the water of the Danube, does not recognize borders. It carries the living and the dead with equal indifference. The real tragedy of Fortress Europe is that it has turned the sea into a wall. But walls, as we know, eventually crumble. In the next part of our continuous story, we will turn away from the border and look at the economic engine within. We will ask the question that few dare to answer honestly. Does Europe actually need the people it is trying so hard to keep out? We will look at the pension gap, the aging continent, and the real math that suggests that without migration, the European way of life might face a much more certain doom than anything the Great Replacement theorists imagine. We will peel back the layers of economic fake news and look at the hard, cold numbers of the future. As we turn our gaze away from the razor wire and the surveillance drones of the border, we must step into the quieter, but perhaps more vital, world of the European economy. While the headlines are filled with the drama of the fortress and the friction of parallel societies, there is a different, more mechanical reality unfolding in the glass office towers of Frankfurt, the sprawling greenhouses of Almeria, and the quiet, sterile hallways of nursing homes in Tuscany. This is the story of the economic engine, the hidden gear that drives much of the migration policy we see today, often in direct opposition to the political slogans shouted on television. It is here that we encounter the most profound and unsettling paradox of our modern era. The very people that many European citizens fear as a threat to their culture are the same people the European economy desperately needs to survive. To understand this, we have to look at the hard, cold numbers of the pension gap and the aging continent. In 2026, we are living through a demographic shift that is truly unprecedented in the long history of human civilization. For the first time, Europe has more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 15. The demographic pyramid that once stood as the foundation of social stability, with a broad, energetic base of young workers supporting a small peak of retirees, has been flipped on its head. It now looks more like an inverted triangle, precariously balanced and swaying under its own weight. This is not a fake theory or a political talking point. This is a mathematical reality documented by every major statistical agency, from Eurostat to the OECD. By the year 2050, it is projected that there will be fewer than 2 working-age people for every 1 retiree across the European Union. In countries like Italy, Spain, and Germany, the situation is even more dire, bordering on a systemic emergency. The fake narrative, often used by those who fear migration, is that newcomers are a drain on the welfare state. that they come to Europe specifically to live off benefits, replacing the native worker while hollowing out the social safety net that took generations to build. But when we look at the real economic data, a very different picture emerges from the spreadsheets of economists. The OECD has consistently found that in most European countries, migrants contribute more in taxes and social security contributions than they receive in individual benefits. They are on average significantly younger and more likely to be of working age than the native population. They are the ones paying into the pension funds that today's European retirees are currently drawing from. Without this constant infusion of new, younger workers, the European social model, the cradle-to-grave welfare system that defines the continent's quality of life, would face a collapse far more certain and far more doomed than anything imagined by cultural theorists. This brings us to the labor shortage crisis that is currently haunting every major sector of the European economy. In 2025 and 2026, the European Union is estimated to be losing between 1 and 2 million workers every single year, simply due to retirement. This isn't just about high-tech engineers or specialized doctors, though those are in desperately short supply as well. It is about the invisible labor that keeps a modern society functioning from day to day. It is the truck drivers who move the food from the ports to the shelves, the construction workers who build the houses for the next generation, the fruit pickers in the fields of Spain and Italy, and, perhaps most crucially, the care workers. As Europe ages, the demand for healthcare and elderly care is skyrocketing. Yet the native population of young people who could perform this work is shrinking at an alarming rate. In many parts of rural Germany and central Italy, nursing homes would have to close their doors tomorrow, if not for the staff who arrive from outside the European Union. There is a fascinating and somewhat ironic real development in European politics today that often goes unmentioned in the heat of an election. We see leaders like Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who rose to power on a hardline, Italy First anti-migration platform, quietly signing decrees to allow hundreds of thousands of new foreign workers into the country. In 2025, the Italian government announced a multi-year plan for nearly 500,000 work permits to be issued to non-EU citizens. Spain, under a different political alignment, has argued even more openly that it needs millions of newcomers just to maintain its current economic output and prevent stagnation. The fake part of the political discourse is the loud public rhetoric about closing the borders and protecting the native people, while the real policy being enacted behind closed doors is a quiet, desperate search for labour to prevent an economic heart attack. Governments are trapped in a vice between a nervous electorate that wants fewer migrants and a business community that says, "Give us workers, or we will go bankrupt and take the economy with us." The Great Replacement theory relies heavily on the idea that migration is a zero-sum game. The belief that the arrival of a migrant worker must inevitably mean the displacement and replacement of a native one. But in the actual labour markets of 2026, we are seeing exactly the opposite. Migration is often what economists call complementary. Migrants tend to take the difficult, manual, or entry-level jobs that native-born Europeans, who are now more highly educated than ever, no longer want to do. This job ladder effect actually drives economic growth for everyone. When you have enough people to pick the grapes, clean the hotels and staff the warehouses, the entire tourism or agricultural industry thrives, which in turn creates and secures high-paying jobs for the native managers, accountants, tech developers, and marketers who support those sectors. The reality is that a shrinking workforce is a shrinking economy. A shrinking economy means less tax revenue for schools, less money for hospitals, and less money for the very European culture that the protectionists are so worried about losing. However, we must also be honest about the real challenges that come with using migration as an economic engine. One of the most persistent and damaging issues is the integration gap in the labour market. While it is true that migrants are net contributors, this is only true if they are actually allowed and encouraged to work. In many European countries, the unemployment rate for non-EU citizens is significantly higher than for nationals. This is often due to real barriers that are within the power of the state to fix. A lack of affordable language training, the bureaucratic nightmare of non-recognition for foreign degrees, and, unfortunately, systemic discrimination in the hiring process. When a society brings in people to fill labour gaps, but then makes it legally impossible for them to work, or refuses to recognise their expertise, it creates a fake crisis of welfare dependency. If a trained doctor from Syria is forced to drive an Uber because the state won't verify his medical license, society has lost a massive investment and gained a frustrated, marginalized citizen. Another real economic friction point that fuels popular anger is the impact on wages in specific, localized sectors. While the overall impact of migration on national wages is generally neutral or even slightly positive, there is clear evidence that in low-skilled sectors, a large and sudden influx of workers can keep wages stagnant for the lowest-paid native workers. This is the real economic basis for much of the working-class resentment toward immigration. For a plumber in a small town or a warehouse worker in a port city, the economic miracle of migration can feel like a race to the bottom. The fake narrative tells these workers that the migrant is their enemy, out to steal their paycheck. The real narrative is that the failure lies with the government and the labour unions for not protecting wage floors and for failing to invest in the retraining and education of the native workforce so they can move up the ladder. We also have to consider the global competition for talent, which is a real factor that many Europeans ignore. Europe is not the only place on Earth that is aging. China, Japan, South Korea, and even the United States are all facing similar or even worse demographic declines. In 2026, we are entering a world where people are becoming the most valuable and scarce resource on the planet. The fake idea that Europe can just turn the human tap on and off whenever it feels like it is becoming a dangerous and arrogant delusion. Why would a highly skilled nurse from the Philippines or a brilliant software developer from Nigeria choose to come to a Europe where they feel unwelcome and where their identity is debated on the news, when they could go to Canada, Australia, or Singapore, where they are actively recruited and welcomed? The reality is that Europe's hostile environment policies and the rise of replacement rhetoric are actually damaging its long-term economic competitiveness. If Europe becomes a place that is seen as a fortress of the old and the bitter, it will struggle to attract the young and the bright who drive the innovation of the future. This brings us back to the philosophical core of the replacement question. If we look at the economic data without the fog of emotion, the real replacement that is happening is a transition of the European identity from one based on blood and soil to one based on participation and contribution. The person who pays their taxes, obeys the laws, raises a family, and cares for the elderly in a German village is replacing the void left by a declining birth rate. They are not destroying the village. They are the very reason the village still has a functioning clinic, a local school, or a grocery store. The doomed narrative focuses entirely on what is being lost, the ethnic uniformity of a romanticized past. The realistic narrative focuses on what is being saved, the actual functioning and prosperity of a modern civilized society. As we look toward the next decade, the economic engine of migration will only become more vital and more unavoidable. The baby boomer generation, the largest and most influential in history, is currently in the middle of its mass retirement. Over the next 10 years, the pressure on the pension and healthcare systems will reach its absolute peak. This is the real demographic crisis. If Europe does not find a way to integrate millions of new workers, and to do so in a way that is socially stable and economically fair, it will face a slow, grinding decline into global irrelevance. It will become what some critics call a living museum, a place with beautiful old buildings and a rich history, but no one to maintain the infrastructure, and an aging population with no one to care for them in their final years. The Great Replacement theory is, at its heart, a story of fear and a longing for a static world that never truly existed. But the economic engine is a story of cold, hard pragmatism. History shows that nations and empires that embrace change, that adapt their identities, and that use migration to fuel their growth and innovation are the ones that survive and thrive across the centuries. The United States, for all its internal flaws, built its American century on exactly this principle of constant renewal through immigration. Europe, which for centuries was the primary source of the world's migrants, is now being asked to learn the same lesson from the other side of the mirror. It is a difficult, messy, and often painful lesson, but the reality of the numbers suggests there is simply no other path forward. In our next exploration, we will move from the complex world of macroeconomics to the murky world of fake news and myth-busting. We will take the most common slogans, the most frightening headlines, and the facts used in the migration debate and hold them up to the steady light of the data we have gathered. We will look at crime statistics, the reality of welfare tourism, and the idea of cultural collapse one last time, with the goal of finally separating the real challenges of a changing continent from the fake fears designed to divide us. We will ask what a History to Relax channel can teach us about finding peace and perspective in a world that refuses to stand still. But before we do that, we must sit with the realization that the stranger at the gate is not just a humanitarian obligation or a political problem. They might just be the person who keeps the lights on for the next generation of Europeans. The flow of the human river, like the flow of the Rhine or the Danube, is part of a larger global cycle. It is driven by the immutable laws of supply and demand, by the pressures of age and the ambition of youth, and by the eternal human desire for a better, safer life. To try to stop it entirely is to try to stop the tides of the sea. The real question for the future of Europe is not how to stop the movement of people, but how to build the social and economic harbors that can turn a perceived crisis into a successful continuation of the European story. If you were to sit in a quiet, dust-moted library, surrounded by the heavy, leather-bound volumes of centuries past, you would find a strange and comforting silence. In those pages, the great terrors of the past, the famines, the plagues, and the migrations of the Dark Ages, are neatly pressed into ink, neutralized by the passage of time. But when we step out of that library and into the glare of the modern world, the silence is replaced by a deafening roar. In our current era, the air is thick with anecdotes, viral videos, and sensational headlines that scream of an impending collapse. This brings us to a crucial stage in our story, the realm of the myth-busting lab. To truly understand what is real and what is fake in the immigration crisis, we have to confront the three biggest pillars of public anxiety that keep the continent awake at night: the fear of crime, the perceived fragility of the welfare state, and the haunting idea of a cultural death. These are the sparks that ignite the Great Replacement theory, turning a complex demographic shift into a perceived existential war. But when we hold these fears up to the steady, cold light of actual data, we find that the truth is rarely a simple yes or no. It is a story of nuance, context, and the fundamental difference between a crisis of people and a crisis of systems. The first and most explosive topic we must navigate is the question of crime. You have likely seen the claims that migration has turned once peaceful European cities into unrecognizable war zones, and that native people are being victimized by a wave of foreign-born criminality. This is the real friction that populist politicians and social media algorithms use to justify the Great Replacement narrative. But what does the data actually tell us when we look past the terrifying headlines? If we look at Germany, Sweden, or Denmark, countries that have taken in large numbers of migrants, the picture is far more complex than a simple rise in violence. It is a real and tragic fact that in some categories, such as robbery and certain types of violent crime, non-EU nationals are overrepresented in police statistics relative to their share of the population. In Sweden, for example, the rise in gang-related bombings and shootings in marginalized suburbs is a stark, undeniable reality that has deeply shaken the nation's historical sense of security and trust. However, the fake part of this narrative is the dark suggestion that this criminality is somehow inherent to the migrants' culture, DNA, or religion. When criminologists dive deeper into the real data, they find a pattern that has repeated itself throughout human history. The primary drivers of crime are not nationality or faith, but age, gender, and socio-economic status. The vast majority of people who undertake the dangerous journey to Europe are young men. This is the age crime curve, a demographic reality that exists in every society on Earth. Young men, particularly those between the ages of 18 and 30, are the group most likely to commit crimes in any society, regardless of their background or where they were born. If you were to look at the history of European cities in the 19th century, you would find that they were far more violent than they are today, driven by a large population of young native men living in poverty during the Industrial Revolution. When you adjust the modern data for age, income level, and education, the gap in criminality between migrants and the native population narrows significantly. If you take 1,000 young men with no jobs, poor language skills, and no social connections, and you place them in a high-poverty neighborhood with no hope for the future, you will see a rise in crime, whether those men are from Damascus, Detroit, or Dortmund. The reality is that crime is a symptom of a failed integration process and deep social exclusion, not a cultural inevitability. Next, we must address the persistent myth of welfare tourism. The fake narrative tells us that millions of people are crossing the Mediterranean specifically to live a life of leisure on the European taxpayer's dime. This story is often accompanied by anecdotal images of migrants receiving luxury housing or massive monthly checks, while native pensioners are left to struggle. In the reality of the economic data, the welfare magnet theory has surprisingly little empirical support. Most migrants move to where the jobs are and where they have existing community ties, not where the benefits are highest. This is why countries with relatively modest welfare systems, such as the United Kingdom or Spain, remain top destinations for those seeking a new life. Furthermore, almost every European country has strict bureaucratic rules that prevent non-citizens from accessing full welfare benefits for many years. The real economic data shows that migrants are actually net contributors to the system over the course of their lifetimes. They are younger, they work longer hours, and they are less likely to utilize expensive end-of-life healthcare than the aging native population. The fake outrage over welfare is often a convenient diversion from the real structural issue, that European welfare states are under pressure because of an aging native population that is living longer than ever before, not because of the newcomers who are working to support it. This leads us back to the concept of the no-go zone, a term that has become a staple of modern fear-mongering. The fake claim, often broadcast on international news, is that these areas are under the control of Sharia law and are forbidden territories for non-Muslims and even the police. If you were to actually walk through these neighborhoods, such as Molenbeek in Brussels or the Banlieues of Paris, you would find that they are not legally separate or occupied zones. They are simply poor, neglected urban spaces. They are vulnerable areas where the state has historically failed to invest in schools, infrastructure, and job creation. The reality of the friction in these neighborhoods is often a classic clash between a frustrated, bored youth population and a police force that is seen as an impersonal, hostile occupying power. When a riot breaks out in a French suburb, it is almost always sparked by a specific incident of perceived police brutality or a feeling of systemic injustice, not by a religious desire to overthrow the secular French Republic. The fake narrative turns a very real social and economic conflict into a fictional religious crusade, making it impossible for the state to address the underlying issues of poverty and isolation. Perhaps the most abstract and difficult fear to dismantle is the idea of cultural death. The Great Replacement theory argues that European values, democracy, secularism, and gender equality, are being systematically erased and replaced by a foreign, hostile worldview. This is the real anxiety of many who feel that their world is changing at a speed they cannot fathom. But history teaches us that culture is not a fragile museum piece that shatters if it is touched. It is a living, breathing, and incredibly resilient process. The fake part of the narrative is the idea that native culture is a static, finished product that can be destroyed by the mere presence of another group. In reality, cultures that refuse to adapt and absorb new influences are the ones that tend to stagnate and fade away. The replacement isn't an erasure of values. It is an evolution of who carries those values forward. If we look at the history of the English language, we see a migrant tongue that absorbed Latin, Greek, French, and Norse elements to become the most successful language in history. It didn't die because it wasn't pure. It thrived because it was a sponge. Consider the real story of Islam in Europe, which is far more diverse and fragmented than the fake narrative of a monolithic invading force. There is a quiet but massive growth of a European Islam, one that is secular, liberal, and fully integrated into the democratic framework of the continent. Millions of European Muslims are doctors, teachers, business owners, and civil servants who share the exact same aspirations for peace and prosperity as their native neighbors. The crisis is not the presence of a different religion, but the way that religion is weaponized by extremists on both sides to create a fake war of civilizations. When we focus our collective attention only on the tiny minority who refuse to integrate or who embrace radicalism, we intentionally ignore the millions who already have integrated and who are the bedrock of their local communities. The myth-busting lab must also look at the invasion rhetoric that dominated the news cycles after 2015. In that year, the numbers were indeed high, with over 1 million people arriving in a single summer. But when we put that number into the context of a European Union population of over 500 million people, we see that it represented only about 0.2% of the total population. The fake sense of being swamped or overrun is a matter of psychological perception, not mathematical reality. The high visibility of migration, people huddled in tents at train stations or queues at border fences, creates a profound emotional effect that far outweighs the actual demographic impact. If those same million people had arrived quietly via international airports over the course of a decade, the crisis would likely never have been declared. The reality of the crisis was not a failure of the native people to survive. It was a failure of government management and a failure of the fortress to provide legal, orderly, and dignified pathways for people who were inevitably going to come. There is also a persistent fake narrative that migration is the primary and sole cause of the housing crisis currently making life difficult for young Europeans. While an increasing population does put pressure on the housing market, the real causes of the crisis are far more domestic. Decades of underinvestment in social housing, the rise of short-term vacation rentals like Airbnb that hollow out city centres, and the financialization of the property market, where houses are treated as investment chips rather than homes. Blaming migrants for high rents is a fake solution that conveniently lets local governments off the hook for their own decades of policy failures. It is much easier for a politician to point at a refugee camp on the edge of town than to point at their own failure to build affordable apartments for the next generation of their own citizens. As we move toward the conclusion of this story, we must ask ourselves, why do these myths persist so strongly, even when the data is clearly available to anyone who looks? The answer lies in the deep, ancient architecture of the human brain. We are biologically hardwired to notice the stranger and to perceive rapid change as an existential threat to our tribe. The Great Replacement theory is a fake narrative that masterfully exploits these real biological instincts. It provides a simple, dramatic, and emotionally satisfying explanation for a world that feels increasingly complex, lonely, and out of control. It offers a clear villain to blame for the decline of old industries, the aging of our parents, and the changing face of our neighborhoods. But the history to relax perspective teaches us that we have been in this state of high anxiety many times before. Every generation in history has believed it is living through the end of the world. The Romans believed it as their borders shifted. The Elizabethans believed it as the old medieval order crumbled. And the Europeans of the 1930s certainly believed it. Yet, the world continues to turn, and societies continue to adapt. The real history of Europe is not a history of ethnic purity, but a history of incredible resilience and constant adaptation. The doomed narrative is a choice. It is a choice to focus our eyes on the friction of the moment rather than the long-term fusion of the centuries. To find peace in a changing world, we must learn to separate the fake alarms from the real challenges of our time. The integration of millions of people is, without question, a real and difficult challenge. It requires enormous amounts of money, time, patience, and a genuine willingness to change from both the newcomers and the host societies. It is not an easy process, and it is not always relaxing to live through, but it is also not an apocalypse. The reality of the immigration crisis is that it is a profound, messy, and deeply human transition. It is the sound of a continent growing and reinventing itself, not the sound of a continent dying. As we have seen throughout this long journey, the fear of the other is an ancient companion, but it is a companion that has been proven wrong time and time again. In our final exploration, we will look directly toward the future. We will synthesize everything we have learned, from the echoes of empire and the hunger of post-war factories to the economic engine and the hard work of the myth-busting lab. We will ask what Europe will actually look like in the year 2050, and whether the Great Replacement will be remembered as a prophetic warning or merely as a historical footnote of a particularly fearful and transitionary era. We will conclude our journey by finding the history to relax within the chaos, understanding that the river of history, though it may be turbulent and white-capped at times, always finds its way to the broader sea. We will look at the very real possibility of a Europe that is not doomed, but reborn. A Europe that is larger, more complex, more colourful, and ultimately more vibrant than anything that has come before. The story is not over. It is simply entering its next chapter, and the pen is in our hands. To move forward in our story, we must now step away from the emotional heat of the streets and the physical walls of the border. We need to enter a quieter, colder space, the world of the statistician and the demographer. This is where we confront the demographic crossroad of 2026. If the earlier chapters of our journey were about the why and how of migration, this chapter is about the must. To understand the true reality of the European immigration crisis, we have to look at the hard, uncompromising numbers that define the survival of a continent. It is here that the debate over the Great Replacement meets the reality of the Great Emptying. As of early 2026, the European Union stands at a historical turning point. For the first time in centuries of growth, the population of the continent has reached its peak, approximately 453 million people. From this year onward, according to every major projection, from Eurostat to the Joint Research Centre, the numbers begin a slow, inevitable decline. This is the moment the demographic engine of Europe, which once fueled the exploration and colonization of the entire planet, finally begins to sputter and cool. The real crisis facing Europe is not just that people are coming in, it is that the foundation of the original population is shrinking. To understand why this is happening, we have to look at what demographers call negative population momentum. Since the 1970s, the fertility rate across almost every European nation has fallen below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman. In 2026, the EU average hovers around 1.5. This is the real math of the situation. For 50 years, Europe has not been producing enough children to replace the previous generation. But for a long time, the population continued to grow because people were living longer. This created a demographic illusion of stability. Now, that illusion has shattered. We have reached the point where the number of deaths is beginning to outpace the number of births, and the large baby boomer generation is moving into their final years. One of the most powerful fake elements of the Great Replacement theory is the idea that this decline can be solved simply by encouraging native Europeans to have more children. But the real demographic data shows that Europe has fallen into what is known as the low fertility trap. Even if every European government were to successfully raise birth rates to 2.1 tomorrow, the population would still continue to shrink for several decades. This is because there are simply fewer women of childbearing age than there were 30 years ago. The inertia of a shrinking population is like a massive ship. Even if you turn the engine off, it keeps moving in the same direction for a long time. This is the real reason why migration has become an existential necessity rather than just a policy choice. Without a constant influx of young people from outside the continent, the negative momentum would lead to a collapse of the workforce so rapid that the economy would essentially seize up. When we talk about replacement, we must distinguish between the fake political slogan and the real demographic diversification. The fake narrative suggests a coordinated plot to erase a people. The real data shows a continent that is desperately trying to fill the gaps in its own house. In 2026, the median age in the European Union has risen to nearly 45 years. In some regions of Italy and Germany, it is even higher. By contrast, the median age of the immigrants arriving in Europe is around 30. They are, quite literally, the youth that Europe no longer has. They are replacing the void in the labour market, the void in the tax base, and the void in the school systems. Without them, thousands of schools in rural Europe would have already closed their doors, and thousands of businesses would have ceased to exist. However, the reality of this demographic shift is not uniform across the continent. We are witnessing what historians may one day call the Great European Divide. In the north and the west, in countries like France, the Netherlands and Sweden, higher migration and slightly higher fertility rates mean the population is still projected to grow or stay stable until 2050. But in the east and the south, the situation is catastrophic. Countries like Bulgaria, Latvia and Lithuania have lost more than 20% of their populations since the 1990s. This is a real and silent crisis. It is a zero-sum game of mobility, where the young and talented people of Eastern Europe move to the West for better wages, leaving behind ghost towns populated only by the elderly. In these regions, the fear of replacement is even more intense because the native population is physically disappearing, and there is no migration to replace the loss. This leads us to a difficult real question. Can migration actually solve the demographic crisis? The data suggests that while migration is a vital cushion, it is not a complete cure. To truly offset the aging of the European population, the level of migration required would be so high that it would be socially and politically impossible to manage. Some estimates suggest that to maintain a stable support ratio of workers to retirees, Europe would need to take in millions of new arrivals every single year for decades. This is the real tension at the heart of the 2026 crossroad. Europe needs more people than it is willing to accept, and it is accepting more people than many of its citizens are comfortable with. The fake narrative often used by opponents of migration is that the newcomers are outbreeding the native population at an alarming rate. But as we discussed in earlier chapters, the reality is that birth rates among migrant groups tend to drop rapidly once they settle in Europe. In fact, in many European countries today, the fertility rates of second and third generation immigrant women are almost identical to those of the native population. This demographic convergence is a sign of integration, but it also means that the migrant engine of population growth eventually slows down as well. To keep the population stable, Europe would need a constant stream of new arrivals forever. This is a reality that few politicians are willing to admit to their voters. We must also confront the real issue of the global talent war. As the world ages, Europe is no longer the only destination for people seeking a better life. In 2026, we are seeing countries like Japan and South Korea, which have historically been very closed to migration, beginning to open their doors out of pure demographic desperation. Even China is facing a shrinking population. The fake idea that Europe is being overrun ignores the fact that Europe is actually in a fierce competition to attract the very people it is often trying to keep out. If the replacement theory makes Europe feel like a hostile and unwelcoming fortress, the real consequence will be that the most talented and productive migrants will simply go elsewhere, to Canada, Australia, or the United States. This leaves Europe with a worst of both worlds scenario, a shrinking native population and a migrant population that is not integrated or productive. The Great Replacement theory thrives on the fear of the other, but the real demographic data suggests we should be more afraid of the emptiness. In rural Spain, there are thousands of villages known as pueblos abandonados, where the last resident died years ago, and the streets are now claimed by the forest. In eastern Germany, entire apartment blocks are being demolished because there is no one left to live in them. This is the real future of a Europe without migration. It is not a sudden, violent end, but a slow, quiet fading away. The replacement is not an act of war. It is an act of survival for a civilization that has forgotten how to grow from within. As we look at the numbers of 2026, we see that the immigration crisis is actually a demographic mirror. It reflects our own aging faces and our own empty cradles back at us. The fake part of the debate is that we have a choice between pure Europe and migrant Europe. The real choice is between a diverse, functioning Europe and a pure, dying Europe. This is a hard truth for many to swallow, as it challenges the very core of national identity that has defined the continent for centuries. But history is full of such transitions. The Roman Empire did not end because of an invasion. It changed because its own demographic and social structures could no longer sustain the weight of its borders. The new Europeans who are arriving today are the latest chapter in a 2,000-year story of movement across this small, crowded peninsula. The history to relax perspective allows us to see this not as a disaster, but as a process. A forest that does not allow new trees to grow will eventually be reduced to stumps. A society that does not allow new people to enter will eventually be reduced to memories. The real challenge for the next generation is not to stop the replacement, but to define what the new Europe will be. If the native and the newcomer can find a shared identity based on the values of the Enlightenment, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, then the replacement is actually a rebirth. But if they remain trapped in parallel societies, divided by the fortress in their minds, then the demographic decline will indeed lead to a kind of doom. As we conclude this exploration of the demographic math, we prepare for our final journey. We will step into the year 2050 and beyond, synthesizing everything we have learned. We will ask what the European dream looks like in a world that has been transformed by 50 years of migration. We will look at the possibility of a continent that has successfully navigated the demographic crossroad and emerged stronger, more resilient, and more truly global. The numbers tell a story of decline, but they also tell a story of opportunity. The crisis is a call to action, an invitation to build a version of Europe that is not defined by who was there first, but by who is willing to build the future together. The human river continues to flow, and the crossroad of 2026 is just one more bend in the stream. To understand where we are going, we must accept where we are. We are an aging people in a young world, and our future depends on how we welcome the youth that is knocking at our door. In our final chapter, we will find the peace that comes from understanding that the end of one version of a story is simply the beginning of another. As we stand at the threshold of the future, looking toward the year 2050 and beyond, we must allow the dust of our current anxieties to settle completely. To truly understand where the long, winding story of Europe is going, we have to look past the immediate friction of the headlines and imagine the continent as it will be seen by a child born today, a child who will be in the prime of their life in the middle of this century. This final chapter of our continuous journey is about the new Europe. It is a vision of a continent that has successfully, if painfully, navigated the demographic crossroads of the early 21st century and emerged as something different, something evolved, and something remarkably resilient. It is a story of transformation rather than an end, and it is a story that requires us to redefine what it means to be European in a world that is more connected, more crowded, and more diverse than ever before. By the year 2050, the demographic winter that we discussed earlier will have reached its deepest point. The silver tsunami, that massive, influential generation of baby boomers, will have largely passed into history, and the European Union will find itself in a state of stable, though smaller maturity. According to the most careful projections, the total population of the European Union will have shrunk by about 5% from its peak in 2026, settling at around 428 million people. But the map of 2050 will look very different from the map of 1950. The real story of this era is the divergence between the silent East and the global West. In countries like Bulgaria, Romania, and the Baltic states, the population will have thinned significantly, leaving behind quiet, beautiful landscapes and smart, high-tech smaller cities. In the West and North, places like France, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Germany, migration will have acted as a vital cushion, keeping the streets vibrant, the schools full, and the gears of the economy moving. In this future, the Great Replacement will no longer be a terrifying theory whispered in the shadows of the internet. It will be viewed by historians as a massive cultural misunderstanding of a natural global transition. The reality of 2050 is that approximately 20 to 25% of the European population will be of non-European descent or come from mixed heritage. But the fake fear that this would lead to the death of European values will have been proven wrong by the simple passage of time. Instead, we will see the rise of a civic European identity. In the cities of 2050, London, Paris, Berlin, and even smaller, growing hubs like Bratislava or Lyon, being European will not be defined by the color of one's skin or the origin of one's grandparents. It will be defined by an adherence to the shared values of the European project, the rule of law, individual liberty, secularism, and a deep commitment to the social welfare state. The new Europeans will be the ones driving the high-speed hydrogen trains, running the green tech startups in Lisbon, and caring for the elderly in the quiet alpine villages. They will be the ones who saved the European way of life by choosing to join it and protect it. The economy of 2050 will be the ultimate mythbuster. After the decades of labor shortages that nearly crippled the continent in the late 2020s and 2030s, the integration of new workers will have allowed Europe to remain a global power. We will see a continent that has moved from being a living museum to a vibrant innovation laboratory. The fusion of different cultures will have sparked a new golden age of creativity in art, food, music, and technology. The parallel societies that caused so much fear and social friction in the 2020s will have largely dissolved as the third and fourth generations of migrants moved into the middle class, married into native families, and moved into the quiet suburbs. The friction of the past will have become the fusion of the future. The fear of replacement will have been replaced by the comforting reality of renewal. one of the most profound real changes will be visible in the very landscape of European cities. By 2050, over 84% of Europeans will live in urban areas. These cities will be smart, green, and deeply multicultural. The high street of a 2050 European town will be a kaleidoscope of the world, a place where you can find a traditional Italian bakery next to a Syrian-style bistro and a tech hub run by a second-generation Nigerian-German entrepreneur. The fake fear of cultural collapse will have been answered by a real cultural enrichment. The German language will still be spoken in Berlin and the French language in Paris, but they will have been enriched by new idioms, new stories, and a new, youthful energy. Culture, like a river, will have carved a new path through the landscape, but it will still be the same river, carrying the weight of history into the future. But we must also acknowledge the real costs of this transition. The path to 2050 will not have been a smooth one. The 2030s and 2040s will likely be remembered as decades of intense political struggle, as the last remnants of the blood and soil ideology fought against the inevitable tide of global change. There will have been moments of social unrest, periods of economic instability as systems adapted, and difficult, often painful debates about secularism and integration. The real tragedy of the immigration crisis was not the migration itself, but the precious time we lost by fighting against it instead of planning for it. Those nations that embraced integration early and invested heavily in their new citizens will be the undisputed leaders of the mid-century. Those that retreated into nativism and fear will be the ones struggling with stagnant economies, broken pension systems, and aging, lonely populations. The history to relax perspective allows us to step back from this drama and see it as part of the long, slow heartbeat of the world. Since the first humans walked out of Africa and into the European peninsula, this land has always been a place of movement. The Celts, the Romans, the Germanic tribes, the Vikings, the Huguenots. Each wave was initially seen as a threat, an invasion that would destroy the civilization as it was known. And in each case, the people of the time were right. The old world did die, but a new, more complex, and more capable world was born in its place. The immigration crisis of the 21st century is simply the latest iteration of this eternal story. It is the sound of the world breathing, expanding, and contracting. To truly visualize this future, imagine a quiet morning in the year 2050. The sun rises over the Mediterranean, a sea that is no longer a graveyard or a barrier, but a highway of cooperation and energy exchange. In a coastal city in Sicily, a young woman, whose grandfather arrived on a small, desperate boat from Tunis in 2015, prepares for her day as a renewable energy engineer. She speaks Italian with the thick local dialect of her town. She loves the local food, and she is a proud citizen of the European Union. Across the continent, in a small village in the Polish countryside, an elderly man is cared for by a nurse who moved there from Vietnam 20 years prior. They share a language, a history of living in the same village, and a profound mutual respect. These people are not the replacements described by the fearmongers. They are the living threads of the new European tapestry. The fake narrative tells us that migration is a zero-sum game of winners and losers, a battle where one culture must die for another to live. The real history of the 21st century will show that it was a story of mutual survival. Europe provided the legal framework, the infrastructure, and the ancient values. The migrants provided the youth, the labor, the ambition, and the hope. Together, They built a society that could withstand the challenges of a shrinking, aging world. The replacement wasn't a loss of identity. It was a multiplication of it. It was the moment Europe finally accepted that its borders are not walls to keep the world out, but bridges to invite the world in. As we conclude this long-form exploration, we return one last time to the bank of the river where we began. The water that flows past you today is not the same water that flowed past your ancestors, yet it is undeniably the same river. The people who will stand on this bank in 2050 will not look exactly like the people who stood here in 1950, yet they will be Europeans in every sense that matters. They will share the same sky, the same history, the same streets, and the same hopes for a peaceful and prosperous life. The doom that was predicted was a ghost born of fear, a fake narrative that failed to account for the incredible human capacity for adaptation, empathy, and growth. The reality is that Europe is not being replaced, it is being reborn. It is shedding an old narrow skin to reveal a larger, more inclusive, and more resilient heart. This process is messy, it is loud, and it is often frightening to live through, but it is the way that history moves. History is not a tragedy, it is a transformation, and we are all part of it. The final outro, a journey into rest. Now, as our long journey through the maps, the statistics, and the centuries finally comes to an end, I invite you to let go of the numbers. Let go of the debates, the arguments, and the shouting voices of the headlines. Take a deep, slow, and purposeful breath. Feel the cool air enter your lungs, and as you exhale, feel the weight of your body as you settle into a place of absolute rest. The world is vast, and its stories are long, far longer than any single crisis, any single election, or any single lifetime. Imagine yourself standing on a high, silent hill, looking out over the vast, darkened landscape of Europe at night. Below you, 1,000 cities and 10,000 villages are glowing with soft amber lights. Each individual light represents a home, a family, a struggle, and a story. From this height, the borders are invisible. You cannot see the wire fences, the legal documents, or the lines drawn on maps. You only see the warmth of human life, huddled together against the cold of the night, seeking the same things: safety, warmth, and a future for their children. Listen to the wind as it brushes past the ancient sun-warmed stones of the Parthenon in Greece, through the deep whispering pines of the Black Forest in Germany, and over the white, silent cliffs of Dover. This wind has travelled over this same land for millions of years. It does not care about the names of the nations or the colour of the flags. It has witnessed the rise and fall of empires that thought they would last forever. It has seen the movement of ancient tribes, the birth of languages, and the slow, steady march of the seasons. It carries the whispers of the past into the ears of the future, telling us that change is the only thing that truly lasts. Think of the great rivers, the Rhine, the Danube, the Seine, the Volga. They are the silver veins of the continent, flowing tirelessly and indifferently toward the sea. They carry the silt of the high mountains and the rain of the wide plains, mixing everything together in a constant, churning, and beautiful dance. They remind us that nothing in this life is ever truly static. Life is a process of flowing, of blending, and of reaching towards something much greater than ourselves. The stars above you tonight are the exact same stars that the first humans saw when they crossed into this land tens of thousands of years ago. They are the same stars that guided the Phoenician sailors, the Roman legions, and the refugees in their small, fragile boats. They are silent, distant, and eternal. They look down upon our modern struggles with a gentle and profound indifference, reminding us that in the grand scale of the cosmos, our fears are small, and our capacity for love and empathy is our greatest and most enduring light. As you drift slowly towards sleep, remember that you are a vital part of this long, beautiful story. You are a single, unique drop in the human river, but that river would not be the same without you. The changes we see around us are not the signs of an ending, but the signs of a continuation. The world is always in the process of becoming something new, and that becoming is exactly where life is found. Rest now. Let the anxieties of the day and the fears of the future dissolve into the soft shadows of the room. The future will arrive in its own time, and it will be built by the hands of those who chose hope over fear. The history to relax is the history of resilience, the profound knowledge that no matter how much the world changes, the human spirit remains a constant and steady force. It is the spirit that builds homes out of ruins, that raises children in the midst of uncertainty, and that looks at a stranger and eventually sees a neighbor. Sleep deeply now, bathed in the quiet realization that the world is, and always has been, in motion. The new generations are arriving, carrying with them the same ancient dreams that have fueled humanity since the very beginning. The story of Europe is a story of survival, of adaptation, and of the enduring power of the human heart to find a way forward. It is a story that will never truly end as long as there is even one person left to tell it. The lights in the valley below are beginning to dim as the night grows late and the world grows still. The wind is softening to a mere whisper. The river continues its long, dark and faithful journey to the sea. All is as it should be. You are safe. You are home. And the future is waiting for you, filled with the quiet, golden promise of a new dawn. Sleep, sleep. Let the long history of the world carry you into the deep, healing peace of the night.